I think it might be better to do it physically, just because the feature, unless Chris, you're actually going to be using the tech. I think it might be better.
Yeah, raise your hand physically. It's easier to see. I might, yeah. I see you, Danielle. Sean, okay. I've got a speakers list started here.
Thanks for joining, everyone. I think people are really excited about this, so looking forward to a good discussion.
I've got to tune off for just 1 second, guys.
Even though it's 7, we'll wait until Chris gets back to actually go live.
All right, Chris, we're going to go live now.
Okay, perfect.
Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name's Chris Glover, and I'm the member of Provincial Parliament for Spadina Fort York. And this is our anti-racism town hall. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got 4 panelists with us this evening. We've got Laura Mae Lindo, who is the MPP for Kitchener Centre, and she's also the anti-racism critic for the NDP. We've got Amin Ali, who's a former TDSB student trustee. Sean Conway from the Curve Lake First Nation, he's a councillor there, and the Indigenous Peoples Committee Chair. And we've got Danielle Morrisson from she's a member of the Anishinaabeg of the Naongashiing, and she's coming in. She's a lawyer as well, and she's coming in from Winnipeg. So thank you all to the panelists for joining us. We were supposed to have another panelist, Zanena Conde. Zanena is an incredible activist, and I've known her for 20 plus years. She's in her 80s. I was talking to her this afternoon. She was gardening, and half an hour before the meeting started, we got a call that she'd fell. She's broken her foot. She's on the way to the hospital. She said, though, that she would try to zoom in from the hospital, and we said, no, don't do that. But I think it speaks to her spirit that she still wanted to participate. She's been an activist for her entire life. She was the first Black woman who was a minister in the Ontario government. She was the Minister of Education in the Ray government, the NDP government in the early 1990s. So it's unfortunate we won't have her, but we've got an incredible range of panelists here. I'd like to start the meeting with the land acknowledgement, and we acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional land of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And what we're going to do is we're just going to give each of us, our panelists, an opportunity to introduce themselves, to talk about what work they've been doing, and to talk about this moment in history. There's an increased awareness of racism and of systemic racism, and this growing awareness is leading to an opportunity. And the purpose of this meeting is to actually develop an action plan for systemic change. And so the overarching question that I've asked the panelists to think about as we're having this discussion is to think about what actions can we as individuals and what actions can we as a group or as a community take to seize this opportunity to bring an end to systemic racism in our society. And so we'll start with introductions. Laura Mae, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. I am actually calling in from Kitchener. My riding is Kitchener Center. So this is land that has been held down, loved, stewarded, cared for by the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the neutral people. And prior to being elected, I was the director of diversity and equity at Wilfrid Laurier University. Worked rather closely with the senior advisor of Indigenous initiatives there. And she had taught me that the land acknowledgement is just the first step. That part of what I'm supposed to do when I acknowledge the land is make a connection to the conversation that we're about to have. And so as Chris has directed us to think about the change that we want to see, and I think about the land that I'm on, and to be honest, not too far from my house, there's a land back action that's taking place where urban Indigenous folks here, primarily, if not like 90%, if not more, of this group are Two-Spirit Indigenous people, have literally taken back Victoria Park. It is the major park in my riding. They are teaching, learning from each other. They are focused on building community here, whether or not the system around them is going to provide them with what they have asked for far too long. They're asking for land that was theirs in the first place, which is the interesting nature of racism, that we are often positioned to ask for things that are actually ours, to be treated with respect, that we should all be treated with, and to challenge systems that are supposed to keep us all safe when they are not keeping so many of us safe. And so with that as my sort of backdrop, I am the MPP for Kitchener Center. I am the critic for anti-racism as well as citizenship and immigration. And I'm also the chair of the Ontario NDP's Black Caucus, which is the first Black caucus in Ontario. It is literally the first time in Ontario's history that enough Black people have been elected in a single party. So we formed a caucus. We've been focusing on anti-Black racism and ways in which community have been left behind in a lot of legislation that's passing. It has been wild to watch solidarity rallies happening all over this province and all over the country and across the globe. But I'm not going to talk about the globe. I'm just going to talk about this country, because we spend far too much time pretending that racism doesn't happen here, that we didn't steal land, that we don't participate in genocide and colonization. And it is part of my job and my mission in this life to make sure that I speak truth to power while I'm in this position of influence. And I'm excited for this conversation. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Laura Mae. It's always wonderful. Laura Mae in the legislature is one of my colleagues, and she just has this incredibly calm demeanor and just cuts the government's statements to pieces without ever losing her calm. It's the most amazing thing to watch. If you know, I know the legislative channel isn't that exciting, but if Laura Mae's up, be sure to tune in. Okay, Sean Conway, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Anin bonjour, everybody. Sean Conway, Deshnakash, Mishisagi, and Dow. Thanks so much, Chris, for extending the invitation to myself to come and sit on this panel. I'm excited to hear kind of what the community wants to hear and respond in our ways. And, you know, I think it's a really good idea. A bit about myself. I'm a councillor here in beautiful downtown Curve Lake First Nation, which is in the Peterborough-Kawartha riding. I've been a councillor here for about 1.5 years now, and we're just sort of sinking our teeth into the community and some of the big policy questions that have been going around in my mind for many years. I was sort of first radicalized during Idle No More a number of years back, and have sort of taken a big look at about the history of Indigenous people, and my community in our relationship with Canada, with Ontario, and how we can make our communities vibrant and thrive in the 21st century. How we can acknowledge our history, how we can take community power and build something really, really beautiful, despite a lot of the inequities that we face in healthcare, in infrastructure, in access to transportation. I live in the rural part of our riding, and it's been many years just to get some aspects of public transportation happening out here. There's still a lot of work to do, but I couldn't be happier with where I've ended up, and giving back to community is the best thing you can do. And I'm sure that you and Laura Mae and Amin and Danielle know that that's the most rewarding work we can do. And also, I was a candidate for the Ontario NDP in the 2018 election, which was a really wonderful experience, and really opened my eyes to a lot of the bigger picture systemic injustices that we have to combat and tackle together. And it's, again, a great testament to you, Chris, in putting this panel together. And, the first step, going back to land acknowledgements is acknowledging that there's a conversation that needs to be happened. So this is a great first step. And if the first step is to make an action list, then that's all the better. So looking forward to the evening. Thanks.
Sorry, I lost my screen there for a second. Okay, thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for being here. Amin Ali is a former student trustee with the Toronto District School Board. He's now a post-secondary student. And he and I go back about 3 or 4 years when we were both sitting on the school board in Toronto. So Amin, would you please do a bit of an introduction for yourself?
No problem, Chris. Hello and good evening, everyone. Thanks so much, Chris, for hosting us and inviting us. I'm Amin Ali. I was a former student trustee for the TDSB for around 2 years, from 2017 to 2019, representing the students on Toronto's public schools on the Board of Trustees, where I advocated against education cuts, supporting Black student achievement, getting involved with the Black Student Achievement Advisory Committee, and working on the board, helping to contribute to the board's new multi-year strategic plan, which has a lot of really bold equity initiatives in it. And for a year, I served as policy officer at the Ontario Student Trustees Association, which represents all 2 million students across Ontario's English, public, and Catholic schools. And we did a lot of exciting work there. I led the association doing our first ever pre-budget submission in 2019, which recommended a major boost to the part of the education funding formula that supports equity initiatives in schools. And I also worked on the association's first ever multi-year strategic plan, the Students' Vision for Education, which had 35 recommendations in 6 areas, one of which was enhancing equity, in which we committed to a review of streaming, specifically towards de-streaming of schools, looking at mandating student well-being and identity collection across the system, across the province, like the TDSB does, and pushing the government to implement true progressive modern sex ed, as well as looking at implementing the true education mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Since then, I'm now a student at the University of Toronto, studying public policy and city studies, and I joined People for Education this summer, working as a researcher there as well. And I also worked last summer in MPP Mark Stiles' office doing research and constituency work. And I'm just really glad to be here. I think there's a lot to be talked about. I think this year I would have never imagined coming on a panel talking about a historic uprising and anti-Black racism in the middle of a pandemic, but here we are. It's been a very, very interesting year. And I think there's a lot of real opportunities, like the status quo that looks 6 months ago. I would have never expected any government, especially this government, to commit to de-streaming, but the status quo is crumbling all around us. And so we have a real opportunity to shape systems and work in a new way to build systems to finally work for Black people and other Indigenous and people of color in this province. And so I'm just really excited for the conversations ahead and see how we kind of chart a course forward that actually puts Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color at the center of policy making in Ontario.
Okay, Amin, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Danielle, would you please introduce yourself?
Bonjour, everyone. Yubanasi Indigenous Cause, Naman Dotem, Anishinaabbeg, Naongashiing, and Dunji. My name is Danielle Morrisson. I'm originally from Kenora, Ontario. I'm currently living in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Treaty 1 territory, which is the homeland of the Ojibwe, Métis, Oji-Cree, Dene, and I think that's all of them. My work started in friendship centers. I'm a proud member of the Friendship Center movement. I started working at friendship centers when I was 14, and my parents met through friendship centers. And so a lot of my work actually stems just by being the child of a radical movement. And I can remember the first time I actually stood up for myself was by not saying the Our Father's prayer in my grade 7 class, and I got sent to the principal's office. And when I went home, my parents said, well, why don't you write a letter to the teacher about how it made you feel? And I did that. And it was a really great learning opportunity for both of us about how Indigenous people are constantly being singled out in classrooms like this. I was only 12 years old. And since then, I have moved to Ottawa. I did my undergrad in visual arts and Indigenous studies. I worked at the National Association of Friendship Centers for a number of years as a program officer. And then eventually I started working with the independent assessment process as an application assistant for residential school survivors that were going through their abuse claims. That led to a position with the Assembly of First Nations where I did some policy work, and then eventually I found myself living in Winnipeg. I applied to law school in 2016 when I had a very young daughter at the time. She was only almost 2 years old when I thought about applying. I honestly didn't think that I was smart enough to get into law school, and under the encouragement of a lot of my friends and my family, I took the plunge and I was accepted unconditionally in 2016. And since then I graduated in 2019. Law school led to a lot of great opportunities for me to get involved with student-led movements, such as the Student Pipeline Action Committee, in which we fundraised over $10,000 over the course of about a year and a half that went towards frontline movements, such as the Standing Rock Legal Collective, and also supporting action on the Line 3 pipeline going through Manitoba. I sit on the Indigenous Advisory Committee with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. I went on the national tour with them when they did Going Home Star. And so we've done a lot of work on that. And I just got my call on Monday this week. So I'm a brand new lawyer and I'm really excited about what that work is going to entail. Thank you so much. Really, what I see my role is as an advocate and a voice for change, and what can I do to empower others and empower my community and just disrupt the system. It's always been about disrupting and dismantling the system that oppresses us, because these systems weren't built to support us. And I had to learn that the hard way through law school by being one of the very, very few Indigenous people that are trying to learn through this very Western oppressive colonial lens. So the fact that we survived law school in and of itself was a huge success, and I'm just really, really proud to be here. And I'm a super proud member of Naongashiing. Great attempt, Chris, on the pronunciation. We'll work on that. And I'm also a proud mother, like I said, so I'm really, really happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Danielle. Congratulations on being accepted to the bar. And it's great, you know, and I think it's really wonderful that you are now part of the bar, because it's a position of influence where you can actually bring your voice, and we need more Indigenous voices. To the audience, to people who are just tuning in, this is an anti-racism town hall, and we are joined by panelists Laura Mae Lindo, MPP Laura Mae Lindo, Sean Conway, Amin Ali, and Danielle Morrisson. And if you have a question on your screen, you'll see a text box. You can just type your question in there. And we are already getting questions from the audience. So we're going to plunge right in here. And the first question is, what is your opinion of replacing the Police Services Board and the SIU with a popularly elected civilian review board with guaranteed representation of racialized people, Indigenous people, LGBTQA+ people, workers, and women? So who wants to tackle that question?
I'll start. No, I think it's an absolutely wonderful idea, and I think we can tie it into some of the work that that Chris and Laura Mae have been doing with the End Police Violence Policy Paper, as it encompasses a lot of those suggestions in allowing democratic representation in our police services boards. I think that if our communities are empowered to see themselves represented democratically, I think that adds a level of oversight. You know, it's not quite it's just, again, a first step into more equitable policing services, but you know, democratically elected police services boards with representation of what the community actually looks like is really important and a great first step. You know, in British Columbia, they elect the Parks and Rec folks at the municipal level. You know, it's not a big stretch for that to happen in Ontario, and I think it's a great first step.
Thank you. Laura Mae.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm in full agreement with Sean. Just on Sunday, actually, in my riding, there was a Black Somali man who was arrested. He had originally been given a dangerous driving charge, and then he has mental health issues. He drove away. Long story short, caught on tape, there were about 10 to 12 officers surrounding him. They took him down, they hit him. It was caught on tape by a couple people. I'm telling you this not to relive the trauma of it, but to explain that part of what the SIU, the calls for independent investigations are meant to do from the community standpoint is kind of cathartic. It's a moment where community members can explain what systemic violence actually looks like and acknowledge that. And the system that we have in place is more about justifying why systemic racism happens in policing. And I think that that's the biggest tension. The more I've been speaking to community about that particular instance in my own riding, and the more I connect it to the conversations that are happening around the over surveillance of Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies, the violence that we're met with when we do something that if it was a white person who had made the same mistake, they would not be met with the same level of violence. I realize that when community calls for independence to look at instances like that, they're asking for somebody to say, do you see the violence that we saw? They're not asking for a justification for it, or they don't want you to acknowledge that there's some kind of weird rationale in the system. They want you to talk about the impact. And I think that community will do that for community. And then that will lead the change within the systems that are hurting us. So I'm all for making that switch and continuing to fight for community representation in oversight bodies. Thanks.
Go to the next question. Thank you so much for that. Let's see. So the next question is, and this actually goes back to a discussion that we were starting before we actually went live on this call. It's about economics. So this is the overarching question that I have is, we're talking a lot about the police, but to what degree is systemic racism about economics? And here's a question from the audience. This person's asking, more than 50% of youth in Indigenous communities are below the poverty line. 1/3 of inmates in provincial federal jails are from the Indigenous community. What measures are taken or can be taken to address such a situation? And just switch back to my screen. Danielle.
Hi, so I live in a province where we're really lacking on justice programs such as GLADU writers, which would have a significant impact on the number of Indigenous people that are incarcerated. When you look at some place like Ontario, which has a publicly funded GLADU program where you have GLADU writers available to Indigenous offenders, there's a significant alternative that's available beyond incarceration, you have to work with communities to look at what alternatives to jail time are available and ensure that that person who has fallen off the path is given an opportunity to, I guess, make amends with victims, to rehabilitate themselves, because really what happens is when people are sent into jail, when they're put back out on their way, they haven't actually received the help or the healing or the assistance that they need. And so they're more likely to reoffend. And those numbers are probably quite high due to places like Winnipeg, where you have a number of Indigenous people that are in the penitentiary or in the remand center. And I mean, when it comes to young people, there's just not enough lobbying behind programming in general. People believe more in punishment and deterrence than they do into rehabilitating and treating the really root causes of these problems, such as poverty, lack of housing, lack of healthcare, social services. I mean, like the list goes on. One of the really innovative ideas that I've seen happening in Kenora, for example, is a community justice center, which has been a partnership between the Ministry of Attorney General, all the healthcare workers, social services, and so that when somebody comes into the system, they are looked at as a person from a holistic approach, and what does that person need in order to survive the system. And this is actually based on a model that was developed out of Brooklyn, New York, at the Red Hook Center, in which they were looking at how do we decrease these numbers? Why are people reoffending? And so that's one way of looking at it, is how do we look at person entering the system holistically, and then also making sure that the province funds it, because there's just not enough funding. People are more concerned about putting money towards jails, which actually costs more money than it would to actually treat that person and get them back onto the right path.
Thank you so much. I saw Sean and then Laura Mae. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Danielle really knocked it out of the park there. And it does stem back to the way that we fund communities from the Ontario level, but also through the federal government. And, you know, we look at some of the First Nations health centers and also the friendship centers, and a lot of the preventative work. That's really where we should be focusing a lot of efforts in providing programming for youth and for individuals who are experiencing poverty or who are falling through the cracks in one way or the other, in being able to reach out to those individuals and give them the supports that they need to thrive, I think is the way to do that. And we see that even in some of the communities in my area. We're constantly playing catch up with the bigger cities and towns and access to resources into qualified individuals who can provide services and support our community members in accessing the education to give back. So it's going back to the social determinants of health in you know, how everything intersects and how everything is connected. And it's got to be a holistic approach in combating those issues like Indigenous incarceration, and that 50% of Indigenous children are living in poverty, which is abysmal. And there are simple solutions to simple problems, but there are complex ways to get about to simple solutions. You know, we can say we need more funding, but we need to know what that means, and we need to target it into those restorative programs, into, like Danielle said, the GLADU writers it's an amazing program. Jordan's Principle is amazing. And, you know, it's just been a total battle for years to fight for those things that, you know, that a lot of people don't have to fight for. So it can be discerning, but, you know, if we keep fighting, that's the goal.
Thank you, Sean. Laura Mae.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll be really quick. I actually think systemic racism is fully rooted in economics. Like the history is slavery, and that was a whole institution that used our bodies to build economic strength and power in some communities and not others. And we are still living with the impact of that reality on this land. And I think that because if that is in fact the root of systemic racism, if it's tied to economics that way, then the solution also has to be tied to economics, which is why there's a call right now for investment. Investment in community for things that have been so long underinvested, underfunded, not supported in the ways that we need. And when money has gone into some of those sectors like healthcare, education, housing, employment, it's left us behind because there's something inside like the mind of the system, because it was built to not see us as people, to not value what we need. And so I think that's part of it. And I would also just add that the notion of restorative justice and investing in that is also how I would see like reparations for a system that has not seen us as human. If you can't just sort of move to a place where now we're all going to say that we all are valued in the same way, when some of us historically have never been seen as people and never been given the same level of opportunity. And so I think that it's really important for us to understand that the notion of investing in community and investing in Black, Brown, and Indigenous people is a way of actually moving us to make amends for a history that we've long forgotten.
Thank you so much. We've got a follow-up question, but I just want to, for people just tuning in, this is our anti-racism town hall. We're joined by MPP Laura Mae Lindo, Sean Conway of the Curve Lake First Nation, Danielle Morrisson from the Anishinaabeg of the Naongashiing. I didn't do that well, okay. And Amin Ali, who's a student at the University of Toronto and a former TDSB student trustee. So there's a follow-up question, Sean, and it's for you, but anybody can respond to this. So Sean, you mentioned inequality in the healthcare system. What's your opinion of the healthcare system today, and where do you see the biggest gap and opportunity?
Well, I think one of the biggest gaps that I've seen is the difference between on-reserve healthcare and off-reserve healthcare, and the ability for communities to have control over the healthcare that happens in the community. Where I live right now, we have a health center which is focused on a lot of preventative side. We also maintain a clinic by an area doctor who does a great job with our community. But that's not the case in a lot of communities. And being able to open up the ability for communities to have access to clinical services in communities, specifically in more remote places where you don't have a couple of hours in a plane to go and see a doctor. That's definitely one of the first steps. Is empowering the communities to find and provide clinical services to other community members, and that way, when the services are provided in the community, there are agreements and there are standards of care, and it becomes a part of a thriving community. Every community should have access to doctors. That's it.
Thank you so much. Does anybody, yeah, I mean.
I think the biggest gap in the healthcare system from an equity standpoint is the fact that we have a healthcare system that, aside from not even being built to serve non-white bodies, does not have, I think, a lot of racialized staff, specifically Black staff, Black and Indigenous staff, who can who understand the medical needs of Black and Indigenous peoples, can diagnose them, and can support them in a culturally responsive or at least sensitive way. Because when you don't have that, you see situations like I saw on Twitter, an Indigenous friend who works in the city of Toronto, whenever she tweeted, whenever doctors realize she's Indigenous, they sometimes note that they're surprised there's no alcohol in her bloodstream. And in BC, there's a gut-wrenching situation that came out a couple weeks ago that the government over there is investigating, where healthcare workers, they're launching bets on whether Indigenous patients that come in, whether there's going to be alcohol in their bloodstream or not. When you have systems that are not built for people without real accountability and don't reflect the populations they serve, you see issues like this. And it's a real problem, and I think it's partly contributive of at least in the US, but also here in Canada, why you see Black, Indigenous, racialized bodies really, I guess, succumbing more to COVID than their white counterparts. And I think in another respect, in terms of the biggest opportunity we have, is that with the big overhaul that the Tories have made to the healthcare system, they've been negative in almost every respect. But I think the opportunity is that the system is in a bit of state of flux. And so I think there's more of a willingness to consider change that there might have been 5 years ago. And so if we can get into office in 2022, there could be a real opportunity to take those changes, turn them on their head, and take this big, massive super agency, which suddenly centralized all of healthcare. And instead of using that centralized authority to guide public healthcare, use it to reinvest, use it to make those systemic changes to medical school curriculum, to the amount of racialized doctors that are in the system, to the amount of culturally responsive healthcare programs there are. The fact that all this change is happening, while it's bad, I think can be weaponized for a force of transformative good if we get into office in 2022.
Okay, so there's a question here about healthcare cuts, and there's a question that we had a discussion. I want to just follow up on that. Zanina Conde, I had a conversation with her about 15 years ago when I was doing research on the impact of student debt in Ontario. And she said to me that, you know, Ontario's tuition fees, which are the highest in the country, our student debt levels are examples of systemic racism. Are the healthcare cuts that the government is making, are those also examples of systemic racism? And should we label them as such? Anybody want to? Laura Mae.
My answer is yes. When you think about systemic racism, I want folks to think about who is impacted by the changes, by the cuts, and what that impact is. Does that impact help them and their communities to thrive, or does it make their life harder? And I would argue that the healthcare cuts have made the life of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks harder. I would argue that the rising costs of getting into university at a time where without a bachelor's, you can't get a job. Like when I was younger, you could get a job with a high school diploma. You could get a job before you were done high school. But nowadays, you have to have a bare minimum your bachelor's. And if you cannot afford to get into a bachelor's program, and there are a high number of educated newcomers, for instance, that are here whose kids are not able to get into a bachelor's program because they cannot afford it. And then the government decided to cut instead of invest in education. That is a racist act because it actually impacts particular races more than others. And so I think the only way that we can actually start to shift and make actual change to address racism is to call the things that are happening racist acts. It's not about the people. It's about understanding how the system is impacting certain people. With this pandemic, when the very first bit of information about how to stay safe was wash your hands regularly, and we have Indigenous communities that our colleague Saul Memakwa at Queen's Park has been saying they're on boiled water advisory for over 20 years. How are they supposed to do that? That was the sign, the big, huge red flag that there is racism in the system. Did they choose to do anything about it? No. Then they are carrying on a racist act. Can they change it today? Yes. Will they? Left to be seen. Muting now.
Thank you. No, thank you for that response, Laura Mae. Danielle.
I just wanted to add a quick note because I feel that there's a lot of misunderstanding about Indigenous students attending post-secondary education, which is that all of our costs are covered, and that is a myth. Reserves get a limited and finite amount of funding to carry out basically all of the duties of running a municipality, and that means that funds are spread very, very thin between education and healthcare and running an entire community. We don't get funding from provinces. I was never able to qualify for a student loan because the assumption was made that I would get covered by my band, and I was non-status at the time. So this is a conversation that needs to happen, along with dismantling and encouraging post-secondary education to keep those costs lower, because while the costs are going up exponentially, it's not like reserves are getting more funding to send their students off to school. There's huge waiting lists, and it's just one of those things that constantly comes up in the conversation about supporting Indigenous students and finding education.
Thank you. So should we label the OSAP cuts that were made? Should we, like, I'm the critic for colleges and universities, so I guess I'm asking, should I be out there saying the cuts to OSAP are an act of systemic racism? You're perpetuating inequality. I mean,
Absolutely, because I think at the end of the day, education is one, if not one of the only, frankly, one of the few tools we have left in this more unequal age. That we have to kind of lift communities up and level the playing field and give everybody that door of opportunity to kind of escape their status of birth and to achieve their full potential. We don't have many levers of upward social mobility anymore, and education is probably the biggest of the remaining ones. And when you cut off access to funding for education for low and even lower middle income families, you cut off access to education. And I think, and if you look at who the OSAP cuts are hurting, it's not hurting kids at Queen's Commerce, which is a very affluent, pretty mostly white program. You're not hurting kids at Brockman, at UFT, you're not hurting kids at Ivy, at Western. You're hurting a lot of racialized, low-income youth studying a bunch of other programs, political science, sociology, social work, communications, English degrees, people, friends who I know who were hoping to become aspiring teachers in the education system to kind of reverse a lot of the issues we're seeing today with educators that don't affect the students they serve. They've had to put their university educations on hold because of the OSAP cuts. And so at the end of the day, when these reductions are impacting the equity-seeking groups who student aid is most designed to support, it's clear that it is a racist act.
thank you. Let's see, let's go to the next question. So, so this is a big question, and I want to extend it a little bit more. What is the Black Lives Matters movement? And I would extend that to say, what is this moment, and how do we describe, is there a definition for this movement that we're in right now, or this moment that we're in? Laura Mae.
So the Black Lives Matter movements that happened in, I think in 2017 is when we started to see and hear a lot about them here, are literally what it is, like what they are calling them, that Black lives matter, not matter more, not like they just matter, which is the most hilarious thing I have ever said in my grown-up professional career ever, right? So the movement is just trying to let people know that we also matter. In this moment, actually, I would argue in 2017, the BLM movement was also in solidarity with other Indigenous movements and queer movements. But I think people were so scared about the idea of Black Lives Mattering that they didn't pay attention to the amount of solidarity work that was happening within that movement. What we have just witnessed, sort of starting in the beginning of June across the country, and so many different locations in Ontario, were Black Lives Matter solidarity movements, where you saw all sorts of people come together, but it was happening in the context of a pandemic. And I think it's really important for us to note that we put our lives on the line to show up at these solidarity movements because Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people's lives matter that much. And so I think as simplistic as that explanation is of the movement, it's literally remembering that because our lives matter, access to education for us also matters. Access to affordable housing also matters. Access to healthcare that meets our needs also matters. And so people have actually held on to this movement at this moment in time in a way that I've never actually seen before, which I think is quite fascinating and leaves me pretty darn hopeful that we are going to be able to, as a collective, do something differently and invest in our lives in a different way, because it's not just one group that's saying that this has to happen for me. It's literally us saying we don't like the way this world is. And so let's do it differently. Let's center different people and let's see if we can make it better.
So to pick up on one point Laura Mae said in particular, nobody's saying with Black Lives Matter that Black lives matter more than any other lives. And I think that needs to be very specifically said. Like when I remember in high school, whenever I brought up these conversations on race and equity in class, a couple people would say, oh, you hate white people. And it is not about that at all, but it is about making sure that that Black communities that have often been disregarded, that have been left behind, that have been tokenized, that have been absolutely ignored, are finally heard as we make decisions on policy, as we allocate funding, as we do the things that actually move the needle, make meaningful change in our day-to-day lives. That's what this comes down to. It's like I saw this great anecdote on Twitter. Like somebody was saying, so what do you say to like low-income, poor, rural white kids in rural Kentucky, which I think have some of like the lowest average income rates in the entire US. And somebody said, what Black Lives Matter and systemic racism means in that context is that nobody's saying that, so it's two things. One, their race is not one of the things making their lives and their economic condition any more worse. And number two, nobody's inherently questioning their work ethic for being low income. If you see a low income Black person, oftentimes people say they're not working hard enough. They need to lift up their bootstraps. They need to, they need to take accountability and personal responsibility for themselves. But if you see low income groups from other demographics, you don't see that sort of kind of rude self-questioning assumptions. And so that's what Black Lives Matter eventually comes down to. It's not that your life is any particularly harder, but it's just that race hasn't been one of the things making it hard, which is absolutely true for Black folks. Every Black person I know, me included, knows we've been passed over, we've been overlooked, we've been condescended to, we've been belittled, frankly, because for demographic reasons. And I think what this moment actually means is no more window dressing, fake equity, diversity, and inclusion stuff. I'm not looking for any more superficial ministers of diversity, inclusion, and youth. What I'm looking for is actual dollars, is actual change. I don't need a minister of education to go out and talk about recognized systemic racism. Like, congratulations, now actually put the money behind de-streaming and put the resources behind to get it right. Don't just do it to make yourself look busy, to make it seem like you're actually changing something, but actually put the resources to make it happen well. And so what this moment really means is actually putting our money where our mouth is, not just offering pretty sentiments, not just offering pretty committees, not just offering lovely strategies, putting the resources to actually tangibly change things. Because at the end of the day, resources and money is the only thing that will end up changing things in our world.
Thank you. I'm sort of keeping notes here, and I do want to come back to that, putting our money where our mouth is. I want to come back to that point, especially when we're looking at actions that are going to come out of this meeting. But Danielle, you go.
Yeah, I wanted to share a bit about my own observations in attending rallies and demonstrations and gatherings in a place like Winnipeg. People might not be aware, but there were at least 3 people that were killed, 3 Indigenous people that were killed over the course of 10 days in April. And that was, since the lockdown, we've seen a number of Indigenous people that were killed at the hands of police. And one of the most beautiful things that I've witnessed with the Black Lives Matter movement is that we've always been able to come together and stand in solidarity with one another. So following the Black Lives Matter rally here in Winnipeg, which garnered about 20 or 25,000 people in attendance, it was a magnificent event to witness, which was probably the biggest in the history of Winnipeg since the strike of 1919. We were a little bit worried about how many people would still show up for Indigenous lives. There was a young girl, she was only 16, and she was killed and shot by police. Her name was Aisha Hudson, and we had a rally here in the city, and there were just as many people. I wouldn't say there was 20,000 people, but people showed up in the thousands, and I thought that was just such a beautiful rendition of, like I said, people standing in solidarity within one another. And I think it's so important to note that all of these movements have always been grassroots led. They're led by Black and Indigenous people, the people that are the most impacted and have no choice but to go and take like the front lines. And it's really, really important to acknowledge how much work they've actually done in the time leading up to, the death of George Floyd. That enough is enough. People are just getting so fed up, and it's just as important to ensure that we center those voices while we're continuing this work, because the grassroots movement is what has kept this going, and it's made the voice even stronger than it has before.
Thank you. And you know what, this is actually a good segue into the next question we've received. And that is, so we've sort of developing a theme here. We've been talking about economics, that the disparity, the racism is built in on economics. And Amin was just talking about putting our money where our mouth is, that we don't just want lip service, or nice gestures. You actually need to change the system. So the question that we've received is, what can we do as individuals? Not necessarily economically, but what can we do as individuals? So for the people listening, and I want to thank the people who are listening, who've tuned into this. This is just to take a little step aside. This is our anti-racism town hall. We have MPP Laura Mae Lindo, Sean Conway of the Curve Lake First Nation, Amin Ali, who's a student at the University of Toronto and a former student trustee with the TDSB, and Danielle Morrisson from the Anishinaabeg of the Naongashiing, yes, who's recently been called to the bar. So she's a brand new lawyer. So congratulations to Danielle on that. And I also want to give a shout out to Touring Inc., which is the company that has organized the technology for this meeting. So the panelists, we are all part of a Zoom call. This is being live streamed on Facebook, and then it's also on the website that you in the audience are watching. And on that website, you'll see a text box. If you have a question, type your question into the text box. We're getting through as many as we can. And the current question is, what can we as individuals do in this moment? Danielle.
Okay, I get asked this question all the time, and I don't know whether to be hopeful about it or annoyed, because at this point, I'm tired of being asked this question. I'll be really, really frank about it, because the answers are out there. The answers have been out there for years. It takes a quick Google search to do some research about colonization of Canada. What is community calling for? What are community organizations calling for? Enough with the performative allyship and posting a black screen. Do something concrete and center Indigenous and Black voices. It's as simple as that. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, thank you. You're getting kudos from the people around. Let's see, Amin, and then Sean.
So a couple of tangible things. One is just this, take up less space and listen to Black and Indigenous voices. Don't make your allyship about you. Don't project your guilt onto people. Don't ask for validation. Listen and hear their experiences. Two, once you listen and learn a little bit, educate and share your friends and family. Challenge their racist assumptions. Just don't bite your tongue or just kind of try and look the other way. Challenge it in the moment. Additionally, I think for those of you in the workplace, when you have Black and Indigenous colleagues, take the time to get to know them. Take time to make them feel welcome. Take time to include them. Avoid microaggressions. One thing I'm going to say as a Black person always gets on my nerves. Stop calling us articulate, please. All the time you are so articulate. Like, it is just, it's well-intentioned, but it is such a microaggression, because it shouldn't be that big of a shock. Or shouldn't be a shock at all. Additionally, I think if you're in a position of management, make the effort to seek out people from diverse communities. At the end of the day, hire the best candidate, but recognize the best candidate looks many different ways. And traditionally, what people fit the best candidate to be is someone who's a straight white male. And so make conscious effort to visualize other candidates for jobs, and as a manager and as a colleague in the workplace, put them in line for promotions, put them in line for positions, and not just tokenistic outward-facing positions, but in positions of management, strategic positions of leadership, in policy and research in particular. And finally, the last thing I will say is that as an individual, realize that at the end of the day, trying to unlearn anti-racism in such a racist system is going to take time. You're going to make mistakes, but if people call you up for it, do not become defensive. Do not suddenly say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Step back, listen, reflect, realize what you did unintentionally, and then make an active effort to continue to correct yourself going forward. And take that as a challenge for further research.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sean.
Yeah, and to both of those points, there are a number of resources out already, and the calls to action are out there, whether it's from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're coming up on 25 years since Dudley George was murdered. There are recommendations in the Ipperwash Commission that have not been acted on. It's been a year since the release of the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, with recommendations that have not been acted on. There is a to-do list, and for those that are in support of these movements to support Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in Ontario and Canada, use your time. People who are experiencing oppression or oppressive systems and systemic racism in Ontario and Canada have a hard enough time then to advocate all the time. And one of the most wonderful things that someone can do is to support those communities by making a call to their MPPs, to their MPs, to their mayors, to their councillors, to their regional municipalities. And you look at all of these recommendations from these reports, this heartbreaking reporting that has come out over the last 25, 30 years. Those recommendations are there, and they're geared for educators, they're geared for municipalities, the province, the federal government, the police services, into every aspect. Pick one, send an email, make a phone call. That's one of the most powerful things you can do as an ally, is to do that outreach to your MPPs, to your MPs, your mayors, your councillors, whoever you think needs to hear that, because there's work to be done, and it's been spelled out what needs to be done.
It is one of the shocking things that we keep getting these reports, and then the actions just don't follow, and the systemic change that we need doesn't follow. And so how do we push this time? And I like what you were saying there, Sean. Laura Mae, I think you wanted to speak to this as well.
Thanks, Chris. I actually wanted to say what Sean was saying. Don't let us as elected officials off the hook. Pick a topic. All the recommendations are already there. Do not stand behind the call to have more consultations with racialized communities. Please don't ever request that. Force MPPs, municipalities, MPs, force us to do our work, to actually implement the recommendations that already exist. Write to our offices and then keep writing us. It's easy as a click of an email. I sent you this message, I didn't get a response. I sent you a message, I didn't get a response. I sent you, until we respond to you, and then make sure that we do our work, because technically the government is left off the hook if you send one email and then think that your allyship is finished. You have to show up consistently. I have to show up as a Black woman in an anti-Black world every single day. It is exhausting. So join me in my exhaustion. Write letters, right? I am the critic for anti-racism in Ontario. Send me your letters. I will accept them. My team is always mad when I say this in public spaces, but inundate my inboxes with calls to implement recommendations. because technically I cannot actually sit back and allow that to happen. When I go to Queen's Park and I say overnight, I had over 100 emails from people, I had 200 emails from people asking for this to happen, the pressure remains on government. The minute you stop writing and you stop pushing me to do my job in that way, the government makes excuses to not do their work. And so I'm with Sean 110%. Put the pressure on us. That is our job. That's how you hold us accountable. And please, for the love of all things holy, don't ask for one more consultation. We don't need them. All the recommendations are there.
Okay. Amin.
One thing they said, Chris, that caught my attention is just seeing how many reports are coming out. And one thing to build on, to look at, is look at the reports that came out 20, 30 years ago and see how little stuff has changed. One thing I'm going to recommend in particular is the education. Look at the Stephen Lewis report in 1992. I was looking at it the other day. That, just the executive summary in the introduction, it looks like it could have been released last week. It is, the recommendations are still spot on, the comments are still spot on. In the PDSB review, I was just looking over that today for work. And there was an excerpt that Stephen Lewis said that he heard a comment from a Black student in Peel High School, how their teachers, their principals, their administrators did not reflect them. And verbatim, it literally could fit today in the context of what's happening at Peel. And so take time and educate yourself a little bit how little stuff has changed. And if you're interested in education, read up on the 1992 report by Stephen Lewis and just compare it to the coverage today, because wow, 30 years and boy, have we wasted a lot of time.
You know, I want to just pose this question following up on the discussion we just had. So we've had 30 years of reports and more than that. But we haven't created that kind of systemic change. What is the barrier to the systemic change that we need to see to create a more equitable society and more equitable opportunities? And how do we overcome those barriers? Laura Mae.
I'm gonna answer that from my actual vantage point as an MPP. And part of what I see as a barrier when I go to Queen's Park and I have to work with government is that they don't actually understand what racism looks like, because far too little of us at Queen's Park have ever actually experienced it. So we see the subtleties, right? I remember being at Queen's Park and they started with using the language of illegal border crossers. That is racist language. That was not considered, what do they say to us, Chris? They say that we have to speak respectfully in the house, but there's a word that they use that we get in trouble if we don't speak that way. What is it? It's not decorum, but they always say something to us because we're parliamentary. That's what it is. It is unparliamentary. So they said illegal border crossers over and over and over again for a period of time. And I remember one of our colleagues said, that's racist, and then was told that they had to withdraw their comment that named that other comment as racist because that was considered unparliamentary. So saying racist things is okay, but calling it racist is unparliamentary. That is a barrier to making the change, because if everybody sits back and thinks that that is okay, then it is very difficult to have those same people in charge to actually implement the change. Which is why I think it's also really important to add to the last question that people have to vote differently. They have to actually take a chance to vote for what they want as opposed to voting for what they are afraid of. I think time and again, we voted against things as opposed to voting for something. So if we vote for a vision of change, of equity, of centering Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices, then you would see a different crop of people become elected to sit in those seats. There would be a different kind of openness to implement these recommendations. That would be my hope. And in the interim, because I don't have time to wait, just keep writing to people because sometimes they cave under public pressure. Rant done.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And I'm going to turn off my screen for a minute. The battery on this computer is dying. I'm switching computers, but I am still here. So Danielle, you take it, please.
Okay, so one of the huge barriers that I see to getting real work done is that education is lacking We live in a country that denies a colonial presence. It's not like we're in a post-colonial world. This is not a historical trauma that we've lived. Call it what it is. This country is built on a history of genocide and ongoing genocide, and teach your children that, because they're the ones that are going to dismantle the system, including us and all of the work that we're doing. It takes just as much work to educate ourselves, and you have to put that same kind of effort into educating our children, because it's going to take years before education curriculums actually change to reflect the type of education that needs to happen in the classroom, and make it mandatory. You know, I was having this conversation with a colleague of mine about educating on, you know, Indigenous history in Canada, or making things, you know, as part of some content in some of our mandatory law classes. Make that history class mandatory, make it examinable, make it so that you're understanding how that history actually puts white people at a place of privilege, and that they continue to benefit from it, and acknowledge that you continue to benefit from this privilege. I feel like it's just something that we avoid talking about because it's an uncomfortable conversation, and we're worried about hurting feelings. And I really am tired of having to, you know, tippy-toe over these issues in a classroom, in the courtroom, when it comes to getting my bar exams. Just call it what it is. And also, why am I seen as an unbiased person when I share my experiences of racism? It is not a wrong thing to call out racism, and I think we need to do away with that attitude towards Black, Indigenous, and POC sharing their experiences. It's already traumatic enough to have to be an Indigenous person or get called out on the street and worry about your life being on the line if you're walking downtown Winnipeg, let alone having to share that in a classroom, or, you know, in training for getting my bar examination done to become a lawyer. Like, I'm just tired of this. So I really think that the education itself, the education system itself, needs to change to reflect that type of work that we're doing, so that there's longevity to that work, that we're not just working on ourselves, that we're really dismantling the system so that it just ends once and for all. Like, the calls have been there for decades.
To follow up on that, I think in Ontario specifically, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that while while the intentions and even the plans are there, the funding isn't there, because we have a broken funding formula in Ontario. Just to give a bit of context, it was set up by the Harris government in the late 90s, and according to a report by ETFO in 2017, in an $8 billion education budget, it took $1.5 billion out for my cares as tax cuts. You look at the per pupil funding in 2017, we ranked at 5th and 10th out of Canada, 18th out of 18th in the Great Lakes, and 45th out of all 61 jurisdictions in Canada and the US. We have a broken funding model that simply does not fund equity beyond a small, relatively microscopic learning opportunities grant, and that doesn't consider the realities of urban education, which is where a lot, not all, but a lot of these equity issues are centered. And a funding model that prioritizes enrollment over any other metric. At the end of the day, enrollment tells you about how many heads you have in the system, but it doesn't tell you how many of those heads are racialized. It doesn't tell you about how many of those heads, the needs that they come with, the trauma they come in with, the barriers they come into the system with. And so through an enrollment-based funding framework, we inherently constrain ourselves as opposed to look at other metrics like need, which can be defined from a socioeconomic vantage point. I think from a demographic vantage point, in terms of how many racialized students you have in your system, certainly from standpoint of student well-being, those other vantage points would allow for the funding to flow and would allow for the lens to be applied that would result in equity plans actually getting resources. But through underfunding and through a model that I think, according to the FAO, is 80% linked to enrollment, you simply don't see that focus on need, and we don't have to focus on need. You're never going to achieve resources for equity.
So this goes back to a question that we were talking about earlier when we were talking about labeling actions performed by government as racist. So is what you're saying, I mean, that the current education funding model in Ontario at the elementary and secondary level, is it racist?
I think it definitely does perpetuate racism. Yes. It's like the fact that you see the fact that you see so many Black such big discrepancies in Black student achievement. If you want to get some great context on Black student achievement, I'm going to encourage you to spend a half an hour and read through a report by Dr. Carl James from York University. He put out a brilliant report in 2017 on moving towards race equity in education that really outlines a lot of the staggering achievement gaps that exist and the huge discrepancies in streaming and graduation rates and attendance at post-secondary. Under any other proper funding model that consider needs and consider outcome and consider equity and achievement, you would have seen dollars automatically flow to support boards and initiatives to get more Black students on a path to student success. But because we don't have that funding model, you don't see that. And when you don't see that, you continue to see those disproportionately horrible outcomes for Black students. And that in and of itself is racist.
Okay. Laura Mae.
I was just going to add that oftentimes people get weirded out when you call things racist. But if you take a step back and you think about the history of the things that we are now calling racist, you realize that they actually are. Like our education system was legally segregated. A lot of people don't realize that segregated schools was embedded in legislation in Ontario. People don't pay attention to the underfunding of Indigenous schools. They don't pay attention to the fact that back when the EQAO was first implemented, the idea was to try and figure out what was happening in different schools. And if you attach the EQAO results to the income and race and ethnicity of the people in those schools, you realized that the schools that were underfunded were highly racialized across the entire province. That is racism. That's what it looks like. The fact that we allow it to continue is why we call it systemic, because the system, the education system, is perpetuating racial discrepancies. We can fix it. We can choose to adjust our funding model, which a lot of educators have been fighting for. We can choose to invest in schools to make sure that they have what they need. Or we can sit back and say, well, the racialized kids are just too rambunctious, and that's why we've got a computer lab with 20 computers and only 2 work. Then you start using racist rationalizations to explain why you're not going to invest. That in a nutshell is racism in the education system.
Okay, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting there. You know, I had this conversation with Zanina before she fell. So just for people who are tuning in, this is our anti-racism town hall. We've got MPP Laura Mae Lindo, Sean Conway of the Curve Lake First Nation, Danielle Morrisson of the Anishinaabeg of the Naongashiing, and Amin Ali, current University of Toronto student, former student trustee. Thank you all for joining us. Zanina Akonde was not able to join us. She had a fall. She's okay, but she's not able to attend tonight, even though she did say that she would try to Zoom in from the hospital. She's an activist in her 80s, and I think it really speaks to her spirit that she wanted to Zoom in spite of being in the hospital, possibly with a broken foot. Yeah, she's a firebrand, and she's amazing. She's anyways, I can't say enough good things about her. I want to go back to this question about the education funding, you know, as racism. And what the system that we have that Amin was talking about, that, you know, we've been wrestling with, is actually gives more money to schools in higher income areas and less money to lower income schools, because the parents in the higher income areas can fundraise. And some of the schools fundraise $140,000 a year, and even up to 200. I think the record was $200,000 in a year. And that goes into all this extra programming that the kids in the wealthiest schools get. In the meantime, as a school trustee for 8 years and as an activist for 10 before that, every year the only decision that was the trustees were left to make was what to cut, because every year there was another funding shortfall. And so when the government, like the TDSB last year, faced a $67 million funding shortfall, it was 10 times that. It was across the province. Every school board in Ontario faced a funding shortfall last year and had to make cuts. When that kind of thing comes up, should we be labeling that as racist, that those, you know, those funding shortfalls? And how do we change the narrative on that so that, you know, the government's actually confronted with the impact of what they're actually doing? It was a question. Anybody want to tackle that one? Laura Mae?
I will tackle all the education questions. This time I'm going to tackle it, but I'm going to put a different hat on. I'm taking off my MPP hat and I'm putting on my doctorate in education hat. And having taught in teacher education for a number of years, and looked at what the system is that we actually, how we prepare students to teach in the system. And from there, they become the principals, they become the directors, all of that stuff. The entire system is flawed because we're afraid to call things racist, like literally. And I think that part of why we're so scared to call these things racist is because we're not centering the racialized people who are impacted negatively by the system. We're centering the non-racialized people who are offended when we call something racist. I need us to center Black, Brown, and Indigenous people and be okay with calling things racist. Because the reality is, for the Black, Brown, and Indigenous kids that are pushed out of school year after year, but told that they dropped out, that on its own is racist. They didn't drop out if from kindergarten, they were penalized more than other kids. They were pointed out more than other kids. Nobody did anything when they were called racist names at school. Nobody even called it racism. And then every February they celebrated Black people, right? Or they would have a week where we all got to eat other people's food. I got to bring in my patties because my peeps are Jamaican. Awesome. But that doesn't solve racism, right? And so from a political side, what I learned in my research was that politicians are more inclined to do celebratory things. So we'll celebrate Black folks, we'll celebrate Indigenous folks. And in order for us to celebrate, we have to pretend that there hasn't been a genocide, that there's no ongoing colonization, that was all in the past, that Black folks are doing just fine, so we can just celebrate them. We won't talk about the Chinese head tax and that history. We'll put up more statues of prime ministers all over the place to remind us of who is in charge. And then we are afraid to call things racist. So my anti-racism work as an education student for my master's and PhD allowed me a space to call things racist. Then I get to become an MPP and I get in trouble for labeling the same things that I saw as a researcher as racist. So I'm going to buck the system and call all of the things racist until there is actually equitable outcomes for different racialized people. And I will do that until I see real change. And I think that other people should be okay with that. And they should join us in calling things what they are.
Okay, thank you. Amin.
To build on what Laura Mae said, I think in terms of shifting how do we take a racist funding model and make it equitable and anti-racist, I think a big part of it comes down to supporting representation of Black people in these positions of leadership. Like Laura Mae touched on teacher education programs. And the fact of the matter is that educators in this province don't reflect the students they serve. If you look at the PDSB review, I was shocked to see this, but 85% of students in that board are racialized. Only 25% of teachers are racialized. That is a huge gap, And that shows that we have a lot of work to do in terms of making our teachers more reflective. But it doesn't even just stop there. When I was at the TDSB, it's not a perfect board, but I think it's better than a lot of other boards in this province. And I think a big reason for that and why they're moving forward, why they've been years ahead of moving towards de-streaming. They have programs like Model Schools, these Learning Opportunities Index. They have Afrocentric schools. Why they have all of these initiatives, while they aren't enough, they're a heck of a lot better than what we see in the rest of Ontario. The reason is that you have representation on senior staff. When I looked around the boardroom, I saw a staff that looked like that reflected Toronto, that reflected all of us. When I first started, two out of three of the board's associate directors were Black. Then Indigenous peoples in all sorts of roles, then people of color in all sorts of roles. And at the end of the day, that's what happens when representation matters. You have a critical mass of people to have such critical conversations, and you also have people who can call out the things that I think are unconscious bias in meetings, in policies. Because at the end of the day, if you only walk in your shoes, you don't walk in anybody else's shoes. And so that's why it's so important to have as many lived experiences around the table, because if you don't have that, no matter how the policy is made, no matter how it's consulted, it is going to contain structural inequities.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to the next question here. The let's see, how should we improve? And this is a follow-up question. It's still on the education topic. How should we improve our education system in around grade 2 to 12, as well as post-secondary, to curtail racist bullying in our schools and to educate and to prevent racist teachers and racist school staff in the future? No takers? I can go to the next question. Okay. Laura Mae. Okay.
I don't want us to go to the next question. I think that we should answer all the questions that come to us. So I will say very, very quickly, how we can tackle racist bullying. I think that in order for us to actually fix the experience that happens to Black, Brown, and Indigenous kids from 2 to post-secondary, you have to think about how their teachers are being taught. Like, I actually think we have to not separate out teachers college and what that curriculum is from the curriculum in elementary, middle, and high school. When teachers are learning in teachers college about the school system, they're literally being taught the system. That is what teacher education is, because they're going to enter into a new system, right? Just like I would argue, and Danielle, tell me if I'm wrong, for law school, part of what you have to learn is what the legal system looks like before you start to learn the nitty-gritty of particular areas of law. But one of the things that's interesting when you look at teacher ed is that the equity courses that are required in your teacher education certificate come at the very end. You do 2 practicum in school with a host teacher, with a supervisor, to practice all of the tools to be a good teacher, except for the equity tools. You get taught at the very end of that whole degree, oh yeah, and there's some racialized kids, you might meet them. And then you get sent off into a school. And then because that gets perpetuated, come grade 2, 3, 4, middle school, high school, you don't have the tools to actually address the things that you are seeing. Sometimes you don't even have the language to know that it feels wrong, but you don't know what is happening, because that's never been taught in the same way that all the other stuff is taught, because it is valued. And so I think that there's things that you can do in the way that the entire system is structured that will help to address those inequities. And I'm going to hand it over.
Who's next? Sean.
Yeah, I just had a couple more points. You know, when I was going through the school system, I didn't feel very supported whatsoever, and that's a fairly common experience. But I want to maybe focus on something that does get into the spirit of what the question was, and into a program that we're supporting here in the community. Is some of our education staff are actually attached into the local elementary and secondary schools, part of like a student success program that's based for Indigenous students to access, you know, culturally sensitive individuals, people that are from this community that are working in the schools and helping connect those students to resources, and being there as, you know, someone in their corner when navigating that system. And I think it's a good system that we have in place to support our kids who are going through there. And, you know, knowing that sort of support is there is nice for me, you know, as a new father, thinking in a few years when my kids are going to those schools that are not necessarily on the reserve schools, but when they start getting into those older grades, that those sorts of supports are something that this community found as a priority. And for us to think about that sort of programming and support system for our kids in all schools, I think is really important. You know, we're seeing now in the last couple of years a lot more Indigenous folks being attached into post-secondary institutions, into public schools, and I think that's a good step. But we've got to make sure that that's equitable for all people, and I think it's a good model to look at.
Okay. Thank you so much. And so I just want to do a brief for anybody who's just tuned in. This is our anti-racism town hall. We're joined by MPP Laura Mae Lindo, Councillor Sean Conway of the Curve Lake First Nation, Danielle Morrisson tuning in from Winnipeg, from the Anishinaabeg of the Naongashiing, and Amin Ali, a former student trustee with the TDSB and now a University of Toronto student. We have a question that's going to take this conversation in a bit of a different direction. And it has to do with the recent decision by the City of Toronto to pay for body cams for police. When the TPS decides to roll out body cams, has there been any recent discussions on policies in order to prevent the action of a TPS officer from turning off the device or from removing it during the situation where there is an abuse or potential abuse of an individual's rights? Or will the TPS be able to just turn off the cameras as they see fit? And I'm not sure if people have the expertise to respond to this question I'm not sure if we have a panelist who can answer this. And for Laura Mae.
I can't answer it entirely, but I can tell you what concerns have been raised when conversations around body cams have come up. I don't know if that'll be helpful for the person,
Sure.
but I know that in my community, because there's been calls to defund the police at the same time that there have been the solutions proposed by police to get body cams, there have been real pushback from community that the calls for body cams are just another way of inflating police budgets. So people like community around me have raised serious concerns with that as a solution to, they don't agree that that is a solution to addressing racism in policing or violence in policing. The other thing that I've heard from community is that there are real concerns around privacy, and that the cams can actually become another way to collect more data. So we've already been fighting against carding. Now we have these body cams where who knows what other information is getting attached to particular situations. And because, again, community talks often about being over surveyed. So you'll have a lot of community members who have who would be considered quote unquote known to police, not because they've done anything, but because they're known to police since they're watched all the time, that there are concerns that the body cam, the information coming there will be a lot more than people even realize. So that's what I can contribute from community on my end about that.
Okay, thank you, Danielle.
I just wanted to share on a bit of perspective from a role that I carry out sometimes as a legal observer. And this conversation comes up a lot about whether you should be filming, say there's a police altercation with someone that's at a protest, for example. And generally, we don't encourage that you film or take pictures, because what can happen is that when someone draws on that evidence in court, it's very easily twisted, and it can be used to further prosecute someone who is actually captured on camera. And so in terms of police accountability, I think that community-led movements like legal observation, which encourage only taking a record of what the police are doing in that instance and not drawing the focus on someone who is being attacked by the police or who's being harmed by the police, is a really effective way of police accountability. That's just one example that is very, very easy to do. And yes, 100%, there is a very strong call to defund the police. When we were at the Black Lives Matter movement at the beginning of June, the rally here in Winnipeg, there was such a strong call from the organizers to have no police presence. They were very, very clear, and they were obsolete because we had grassroots-led movements like the Bear Clan Patrol and the Mama Bear Clan Patrol. And these are built on things that have been around for decades. I grew up in a place like Kenora, where the Friendship Center built the street patrol because there were so many people that were dying of exposure. And so they literally just took civilians and our own people to take safety into our own hands. Safety and accountability should 100% be community led.
Okay. That's really interesting, actually. There was a mall near my house where there was a problem with youth raiding and stealing, and they brought in elders into the community, not native. It was a different community, but they just put a whole bunch of tables in the middle of the mall and invited the older people to come and play cards, and everything settled down. Young people tend not to misbehave. So it's interesting what you were saying about the mother clan. We have a question here from a social work student, and she says, as a social work student, I know a lot about the history of my profession and she quote unquote, helping professions in perpetuating racist systems and beliefs about and being complicit in genocide. With an ongoing discussion about shifting from enforcement-based community work, i.e. policing, to work that prioritizes community well-being, mental health, and economic initiatives, how can we ensure that social initiatives don't fall into the same racist patterns that they have in the past? It's a big question. Do you want me to, should I read it again? Yes? Okay, I'll read it again. It is a big question, so it's important. As a social work student, whoops, hold on. As a social work student, I know a lot about the history of my profession and other quote unquote helping professions in perpetuating racist systems and beliefs and being complicit in genocide. With an ongoing discussion about shifting from enforcement-based community work, i.e. policing, to work that prioritizes community well-being, mental health, and economic initiatives, how can we ensure that social initiatives don't fall into the same racist patterns that they have in the past? Sean.
Well, I think to the person that asked the question, what they're doing right now and participating in this and educating themselves and wanting to be a part of that discussion in changing the way that historically a lot of the agencies have acted, I think is a great, again, first step. We're always talking about first steps, and unfortunately, that's where we are. But really, that's a great place to be, and thank you for tuning in and being a part of this discussion and acknowledging that history, because when we do see this sort of broad transformation of society where we can stamp out systemic racism and we can decolonize the way that our country runs, we need people that are compassionate, that know history, that can interact with communities in a fulsome and holistic way and have a balanced approach to providing care and helping. So I hope that answers it.
Okay, Danielle and then Laura Mae.
One of the key things that needs to happen when we're doing this work is to ask the question of whether there's someone else that has already been doing this work for a number of years, and to make sure that you're supporting them in those efforts so that you're not overlapping or overstepping. I think it's very easy to feel really encouraged and like, I'm going to take action, I'm going to do something, and then start getting all the people involved in your circle. Meanwhile, there are Indigenous-led movements that are already been trying to do this work and who are giving the same answers, but they're not being listened to because they are Indigenous. I remember being in law school in my second year when the Gerald Stanley verdict came out, and Kent Roach was a guest speaker at our school, and he wrote a book on the trial. He filled up an entire classroom full of students and professors, and although it was so great that he was doing this work and he was raising awareness, I just couldn't help but think, why weren't we listened to as students? Why we were not having these conversations in the classroom? We try to invite people to have these discussions outside of the classroom because nobody wanted to engage on it. And the same thing happens at the community organization level. There are tons of underfunded organizations that try to do this work and they're just not supported. And so if it means that you have to set your ego aside and support someone else in that work, then that is absolutely what you need to do. Ensure that you're not following into the same pattern that has just led to, I don't know, the supporting of this racist system. They're all racist, the education, the healthcare system, our legal system, our justice system. I hope that when people are listening to everything that we're saying, that they look at it through the lens of what we're sharing and that apply it to every single system. These are not unique answers that will only apply to our schools. These are all the same type of approaches that you can use at law school, for example. Everything that Laura Mae had shared about how do we train our educators, that 100% applies to the same thing. People that are in these positions of powers, judges, lawyers, doctors, nurses, look at how you're educating those people.
Thank you. That's really powerful. You know, Laura Mae, I know you want to answer that question. I want to throw one more piece to it. Saul Mamakwa is our colleague from Northwestern Ontario, and he's one of the first First Nations representatives in the legislature, and he constantly refers to Queen's Park as the colonial government. And I've been thinking, you know, and when he first said that, I had to think, and I walk in the main doors of Queen's Park, and all of the pictures in the main corridor are white men in red coats. And then when you go down the other corridors, it's all the speakers of the House, and they're all white men except for your uncle, Laura Mae. And so, and then there's in one corner on the east wing, there's a section for women, and on the second floor, there's 2 rooms called the Meeting Place, which celebrate Indigenous heritage. And in my riding, or not too far from my riding, in Lake Ontario, there's I know there's a bit of preamble, but when they were putting in the water treatment plant, they actually came across 11,000-year-old footprints in the clay, a man, woman, and child. And so those were some of the first peoples of this land, you know, after the Ice Age. And so for 11,000 years, there's been, you know, people on this land. And so far as we can predict, you know, 50% of them were women, and all but the last 400 years were Indigenous people. And so how do you feel about, like, you're talking about all these systems are being racist. Laura Mae, you're a member of provincial parliament now, and you walk into the same building. What's your response when you walk into that building?
My response when I walk into Queen's Park is that I'm walking into the belly of the colonizer, like literally. My very, very first thought, and in fact, I did my maiden speech, like your first official speech. As an elected official, you get 20 minutes to talk about anything you want. Most people talk about like something awesome in their riding, and I talked about how uncomfortable it is to be a Black person in that chamber. When I look at where the speaker is sitting, above his head is written 1867, because that's the year that this became the place that we're in, and I wasn't a person yet. And every single time I look at the speaker, which is where we always have to direct our comments, you always have to look right there, I am reminded that I am an anomaly to be in this place. So that is how I actually feel. I walk past the Hall of Speakers, and it's true, my uncle is Alvin Curling, so he was the first Black elected Speaker of the House. I used to say he's the first Black Speaker of the House because that's what I thought it was. And one day he said to me, actually, when my name was put forward, they used to appoint speakers. But when my name was put forward, they decided it was time to elect speakers, and I happened to still get elected. So it's important to recognize that that is what happened. So there's him, and across, I cannot remember the speaker's name prior to the current speaker that we have, but I believe he is, I want to say he's Métis.
Dave Levac?
Sorry?
Dave Levac?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's it. And they're at the end of this big long hall. There are little plaques that represent different things at Queen's Park, and I've found a couple of them. But to be honest, it is a very scary experience to be a person of color in that space. And every day you are reminded of what you are now a part of. And so if we don't push back, and if we are told it's unparliamentary to call systems that have oppressed us oppressive systems and racist systems, then we're literally perpetuating the same harm on our own people. That is a horrible thing to feel. But I did want to take that and go back to the question as well, because part of what I have to do at Queen's Park is what the person who asked the question can also be doing in their profession. I have to decolonize Queen's Park. My body being there already starts that decolonization process. The call to have a Black caucus in the NDP started that continued that decolonizing process. Having Saul speak in Queen's Park and talk about the realities of his community, and say words that people didn't think would ever be said in that space, because in 1867 we weren't people, decolonizes that space, because now it becomes part of the cockles of history for the province. I think for the person who's thinking about those social services, that is a valid concern. And in fact, in our End Police Violence document, and we're talking about investing in community, one of the things that we also say is that we have to make sure that culturally responsive training becomes a mandatory part of all of these systems, because every one of them has been built to not see us as human. It's not just policing, it's the criminal justice system. And it's not just that, but it's the healthcare system and the education system and all the systems. And so looking at things like One Vision, One Voice, which was a document that was recently published, and they were doing work in child welfare. That is a horrid system if you think about the colonial roots of our welfare system, but work has been done to decolonize that system and turn it into a system of care. Like, we're not arguing that certain kids don't ever have any problems and that certain communities don't need help. We're just arguing that we should not be harmed when we call for help. And I think that that's one of the hardest things for people that don't experience what we experience. It's the hardest thing for them to swallow, but it's a reality.
You know, we're going to be summing up shortly, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to just sort of summarize where we're at, and also to think about the action items, because we want to come out of here. One of the first questions was, what do we do as individuals? So when you're thinking about your final thoughts, if you could think about what actions we should do as individuals, what actions we should do as groups. In the meantime, I just want to say, I want to thank you for being here. It's an incredible privilege for me as a gray-haired white guy to be part of this discussion and to hear your experiences and to come to at least some understanding of your experiences and where we need to go to create, a better province, a better country. And so thank you all for being here. And that's not the final though. We are going to go around, and if each of you could just take a few minutes to sort of summarize what you've heard in this conversation and what people in the audience can take away from it, what actions they should be looking at in thinking about this meeting. So who would like to go first? Sean.
Yeah, and again, thanks to you, Chris, and your team for putting this together. I think this is a great thing for us to be a part of, but also for the audience. And I'll just go back to something that I said earlier, was the recommendations that all of these different reports have been put out for decades now. That's the to-do list, and that advocacy, we know that you as an audience member support these ideas, and the way to take that and turn it into action is to, again, what Laura Mae was talking about, is make the phone calls to your MPP, to your MP, to your mayors, your councillors, your regional government, to anyone that'll listen. And because these calls are there, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the Ipperwash Commission, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. There are so many things that need to be done, and it starts there. And then on another note, we're all spending a lot more time at home these days. One of the things that we can do to support Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, is to consume media produced by Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color. It's one of the most helpful things that we can do is to, nobody buys CDs anymore, but you can download some music, pay for it, buy books, interact with so much great art that's out there. There are so many artists right now that are really feeling a pinch from not being able to perform, to be on the road or do what have you. Start consuming media that is diverse. I think, it's one of the most rewarding things you can do, alongside calling your MPs, MPPs, mayors, and councillors. But thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Sean. Who would like to go next? Danielle?
I was just like hurriedly taking some notes. What can you do as an individual? You can educate yourself and allow yourself to be corrected. Know that this is not about you nor your ego when you're doing this work. Don't do this type of work for the clout or to add it on your CV as having gained some experience in anti-racism work. This is about BIPOC people. Educate and correct others in your circle. Know that the work that is like some of the true work that happens is being able to be the only person in the room that calls out your friends or your colleagues or people that are in those positions of authority to correct them. And then educate your children and our young people, and then let them take the lead. Young people are such a gift, and I have so much hope for our future when I see young people taking over TikTok and speaking out about racism. Not that I encourage TikTok because I've heard some really crazy things about it lately. But let the young people take the reins. They have so much potential as the voices of our future. And take the privilege that you have as a person in a position of power and privilege and use that to amplify the voices of other people who have been silenced forever and are continuing to be silenced. And more specifically, I think from an Indigenous perspective, I really see so much work happening on the community level to revitalize our own ways of doing things. And I want to put a strong call to this entire country that is listening, that we have always been a sovereign nation, that it has always been about nation to nation relationship building, and that our laws have existed since time immemorial, and that it's not about just implementing certain cultural aspects or legal traditions into the current systems that we have. It's about dismantling those systems altogether because they're built to oppress us. Oh, I could really go on about this for hours, but I think I'm going to leave it with those few final thoughts. And I just want to say to Chris and your whole team, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm just so hopeful when I get to share the space and have these conversations with people like Sean and Laura Mae and Amin. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much for being here. Laura Mae, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Chris. So I'm reading this new book called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And apparently there's a workbook that goes with it. I love it. I have not finished it, but I love it because he speaks about his own journey as a Black man in the States, becoming anti-racist and actively always having to be anti-racist. It's literally a state of mind, which leads me to the next thing that I want everyone to do. I want everyone to go to their respective places and go find Redemption Song by Bob Marley and just play this one part. I just want you to play over and over again. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Because it's not up to me to free your mind. If you want to be anti-racist, then you have to emancipate yourselves. You have to think differently about the world you live in. You have to be okay with that. Like emancipation is a good thing. And you have to free yourself from the way that that society has taught you to think about things. Because for racialized folks, if you center us, our experiences are vastly different. So I think if you read that book and then you sing that song, everything will be awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Awesome. You know what? I think seeing that was really powerful because it's a mnemonic device and it's in my head now. And I will be thinking about that for the next day or two. So thank you for singing. Okay, Amin.
So thanks, Chris, for taking time to organize this important conversation. For me, the big thing going forward is let's make this moment go past the news cycle. At the end of the day, systemic racism is not going to end the minute that the TV cameras go off and the media cycle moves on to the next big thing. Black trans women are not going to suddenly stop dying because the coverage has happened. This is going to be a decades-long, lifelong fight against systemic racism. It took 400 years to set up the system, and it's going to take decades and decades to undo it. And I think it's really important for us to not just confine ourselves in that space. And so a big thing that people can do is in their own lives. Just as a starting point, watch how you engage the Black, Indigenous, and people of color in your own lives, professionally, personally, and just be conscious of things, of microaggressions in particular. Because at the end of the day, for me, what I see is it's not, what really gets most Black people, it's not these big acts of police brutality that you suddenly see on camera, but it's the day-to-day microaggressions that wear you down and make you feel like you don't fit in anywhere. And I guess beyond that, what we can do going forward is let's find ways to turn these intentions into something tangible. I've been saying this refrain a lot nowadays, but at the end of the day, the road to systemic change is not paved with good intentions. Intentions are important, but it will not get us where we want to go. You need to take it then one step further and actually translate it into action. And so commit to yourself to do some tangible things. Like if you're in Toronto, make a donation to the Black Legal Action Center, which does incredible work in supporting Black communities. Take time and read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Learn about the history of I Don't Know More, and maybe understand why Sean got so engaged in Indigenous activism because of it. At the end of the day, we're not going to get to where we want to get to in an ideal society simply by thoughts and lovely words alone. It's going to take real action. And so that takes a real commitment from all of us.
Wow. Thank you so much. And, I want to thank all of you on the panel for being here. I know it must be tiring at times to have to educate people all the time about your own experiences, but I appreciate the energy that you're putting into and that you gave us tonight. The 2 hours that you spent here with sharing your experiences, sharing your thoughts, helping to educate us, because we all were raised in a racist society, and we're all trying to understand that better. And these kind of conversations really do help us. And hopefully, now we have some actions, specific actions, and also, just consciousness raising actions as well. So thank you all to the panelists. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy, for sharing your experiences with us. And before we go, I also want to acknowledge Yash and Richa from Touring Inc., who managed the technology here tonight, it is just an amazing thing, this technology. I don't know how it's quite working. And I also want to thank Pranav and Nancy and Benna from my office, who have been working behind the scenes, who made sure that all of the panelists got here, that the audience got here, and everybody else. So thank you, everybody, for making this happen. And thank you so much to the audience. Thank you for being part of it. Thank you for your interest in this issue. And this is not the end. This is just another step along a long journey. So thank you very much for being here.